Folks called that bend of Miller's Creek Crow Water long before anyone bothered to lay rails through our county, and long before men with clean boots came carrying maps they swore were true. It got its name the way most things did out on the frontier, by sticking around long enough to be feared. The water there didn't run friendly. Even when it was low, it moved like it had a grudge and nowhere else to take it. I was just a boy then, more bone than muscle, barefoot when I could get away with it. I rode along with the hands from the double bar, mostly keeping quiet, mostly watching. That's how boys survived around grown men in wide country. You learned fast, and you didn't ask too many questions unless you were ready for the answers. The man I watched that morning was Mason Reed. Mason rode like the saddle had been made for him and no one else. Tall, weathered, calm in a way that didn't invite conversation. The other ranch hands respected him, but they gave him space, like you give space to a mule that's been kicked one too many times. People said he'd gone quiet after the fire, after he lost his wife and baby. Nobody told the story straight, not in public. Out there, grief wasn't something you explained, it was something you carried. We were checking fence near Crow Water, following the line where the wire ran close to the creek. The wind was doing what it always did, dragging dust across everything and daring you to complain. Mason was quiet, and the horse under him, an old bay with a scar on its shoulder, moved like it had seen enough trouble to recognize the smell of more coming. That's when I saw it. At first, it looked like drift, something the creek had stolen from upstream and decided to leave behind. But it didn't float like ordinary trash. It floated heavy, stubborn, and wrong. A feed sack snagged in the mesquite roots where the water bent and slowed. I pointed without thinking. Mason didn't answer. He just turned Thunder off the trail and down toward the bank. He dismounted and stepped into the creek as if the cold didn't matter. Water climbed his boots and darkened the leather. The sack bumped against the roots again, and I remember thinking how tight the knot looked at the top, how it wasn't a careless knot. It was the kind a man ties when he doesn't plan on coming back. Mason reached for it, and then the creek made a sound that didn't belong to the creek. It was so faint you could have blamed the wind, a thin little whimper, like a match trying to stay lit. Another sound, smaller, desperate. Mason hauled the sack to the bank and dropped to his knees like the ground had pulled him down. His hands, those big ranch hands, started working at the knot fast but careful, like speed might save something and roughness might kill it. I stepped closer, heart beating like hooves in a canyon. When the mouth of the sack opened, something inside shifted. A tiny hand pushed up through the wet burlap, pale, trembling, barely strong enough to argue with the fabric. And then came a voice, more breath and sound, shaping one word that didn't make sense out there in that lonely place. Mama. Mason's face changed in a way I'll never forget. Not anger, not fear, something worse and better at the same time, like a man hearing a door open in a house he thought had burned down. He reached in and lifted out a baby girl. She was soaked through, too still, too cold-looking, hair plastered to her head, lips the wrong shade, eyes barely open, the kind of small that makes you wonder how the world ever expects them to survive. She didn't cry loud, couldn't, but she breathed, shallow and stubborn, fighting. For a moment nobody moved, not me, not Mason. Even the creek seemed to hush, as if it wanted to see what kind of man he was going to be next. Mason tore off his coat and wrapped her tight, pulling her against his chest like he could give her heat through sheer will. I saw his throat work, like words were stuck there. Thunder shifted behind him, snorting softly, ears pinned forward. Mason rose, careful not to jostle the baby, and swung into the saddle with her hidden inside his coat. He leaned down and looked at me once. His eyes weren't wild, they were steady, steady the way a blade is right before it cuts. He said, "Run back and tell the foreman. Tell him I'm taking the doctor's road." I tried to speak, but what came out was smaller than my pride. What if she dies? Mason didn't answer that question. He only pulled the reins, pressed his heels in, and Thunder lunged forward, Dirt and damp grass kicked up under the hooves. The baby's tiny fingers, just visible for a second, clenched a fistful of Mason's shirt like a promise she didn't know she was making. In a breath, they were tearing across the prairie toward town, and I stood there with the empty sack collapsed on the bank, dripping creek water into the mud like it was trying to wash itself clean. I remember the way the mesquite branches shook in the wind. I remember the crows lifting off slow, as if they'd been waiting for the creek to finish whatever it had to say. That was the moment I learned something about the West. Some sacks are made to carry feed, some are made to carry secrets, and once the water delivers a secret to the wrong hands, or the right ones, it doesn't matter how rich a man is or how quiet a town likes to stay, the story has already started moving downstream.
By the time Mason Reed hit the outskirts of Dry Hollow, the morning had split wide open. The sun was up enough to turn every window into a hard glare, and the dust on the road rose behind Thunder like a second shadow that didn't want to let go. Dry Hollow wasn't much of a town, not on any proud map. It was the kind of place that survived by minding its own business, wooden storefronts leaning into the wind, a saloon that smelled sour even before noon, and a few folks who'd learned to look away at the right moments. But when Mason came in riding like the devil was nipping his heels, people looked anyway. They couldn't help it. He didn't slow for stares. He didn't call out. He didn't explain. He rode with one arm locked tight inside his coat, holding that tiny bundle against his chest, like if he loosened his grip for even a second, the whole world might steal her back. And with every hard stride Thunder took, Mason carried more than a baby girl. He carried a memory that rode as close as breath, the crackle of fire, the helplessness, the sound of a child's last cry swallowed by smoke. He didn't speak of it. Men like Mason didn't, but it sat in him all the same, like a bullet lodged too deep to pull out. When he reached the clinic at the corner of the street, he didn't bother with manners. He slid off Thunder before the horse was fully settled and shoved the door open so hard the hinges complained. Inside smelled like camphor and old paper and the sharp bite of alcohol. A cramped room, shelves of bottles, a stove in the corner, a ledger open on the counter, like the town's small illnesses had been lining up politely for their turn. Dr. J. Hollis looked up, annoyed for exactly one heartbeat. Then he saw what Mason held. Hollis had been patching up frontier folks for years, broken bones, bad cuts, fevers that took more than they gave back. He'd seen men bleed and children wheeze and mothers pray their way through grief, but the sight of a half-frozen baby dragged something heavy across his face. He didn't waste time asking questions that didn't matter. "Table," he said, already moving. "Put her on the table." Mason laid the bundle down with a gentleness that looked strange on him, like seeing a wolf handle a songbird without crushing it. His fingers hesitated at the fabric, as if he was afraid what he'd see would be worse than crow water. Hollis peeled back the fabric and gave one sharp breath through his nose. The baby's lips were still tinged blue. Her skin looked too pale, too tight, like the cold had tried to turn her into something that didn't belong in this world. "How long was she in the water?" Hollis asked. Mason swallowed. "Don't know." Hollis didn't scold him. Doctors out here didn't have much patience for blame. Blame didn't warm a body. He reached for blankets, moved the baby closer to the stove, careful, not too close, then set a kettle to warming. His hands were fast and steady, the kind of hands you trusted without knowing why. Mason stood there, useless for the first time in a long time. On a ranch, he could fix what was broken. A fence post didn't die if you failed it. Wire didn't slip away if your hands shook. But a baby? A baby could. Hollis wrapped the infant in heated cloth, rubbed her limbs to coax blood back into them, and pressed 2 fingers gently to her wrist. Then he leaned close, listening for breath. "She's cold through," he muttered. "Hypothermia, and she's been without food." He paused, and Mason felt his stomach drop, because doctors paused when the next word had teeth. "She's fading," Hollis finished. Mason's voice came out rough. "Tell me what to do." Hollis looked up at him, really looked. He saw a hard man trying to become careful in a hurry, and he saw something else too, something that wasn't just panic. It was that old grief, the kind that waits in the dark and jumps when you least expect it. "You'll do what I tell you, and you'll do it quiet." Mason nodded once, like he'd been sworn in. Hollis mixed a little warm sugar water, nothing fancy, just a kind of remedy a frontier doctor kept in his pocket when the world didn't provide better. He tipped a few drops on the baby's lips and watched for the smallest response. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the baby's mouth moved, barely, a faint swallow, a breath. Mason leaned closer without thinking, his head lowering like the baby's whisper had a gravity all its own. Her eyes fluttered half open, and her lips shaped a word that made no sense at all, and all the sense in the world at once. "Mama." Hollis frowned, almost irritated by the cruelty of it. "She doesn't know what she's saying," he muttered. Mason didn't take his eyes off her face. "Maybe she does," he said quietly. Outside, the town kept moving. A wagon rattled past. Someone laughed down the street like nothing was changing. But in that small clinic, time narrowed to one fragile breath at a time. Hollis kept working, warming blankets, checking the baby's chest, rubbing her hands, adjusting her position near the stove. He moved like a man fighting something invisible and stubborn. And for the first time since Mason Reed had ridden in, Hollis spoke in a tone that wasn't just command, but concern. "I need someone to sit with her, someone steady, someone who can keep her warm and watch her breathing while I prepare what little I can." Mason let out a short, humorless breath. "Steady ain't exactly what folks call me." "Well, folks don't get a vote today," Hollis said, without looking up. Mason stood at the edge of the table, hands hovering and pulling back again, terrified of doing the wrong thing. He watched Hollis's every move, memorizing the way he tucked the blankets, the way he tested warmth, the way he timed the baby's breaths, like if he learned it fast enough, he could undo what the creek had tried to finish. The baby's tiny fingers twitched once under the cloth. Mason offered a finger cautiously, like he was approaching a skittish animal. A moment later, those tiny fingers closed around him, weak but real. Mason's shoulders dropped a fraction. Not relief, he wasn't that lucky yet, but something like proof she was still here, proof she was still fighting. Hollis glanced at the grip and gave a small nod, not celebrating, just acknowledging. "That's good, that's very good." Mason breathed out slow, as if he'd been holding his lungs tight since the creek bank. And even then, even in that first thin stretch of hope, his mind kept racing ahead to the questions nobody wanted to say out loud. Who tied the knot? Who threw her away? And what kind of town was Dry Hollow going to be when the truth finally walked down Main Street and demanded to be seen? For the moment, Mason Reed didn't chase answers. He didn't chase vengeance. He didn't chase anything except the next breath, and the next, and the next, standing guard in a doctor's office while a baby girl fought her way back from the cold. Grace Harper taught in the one-room schoolhouse at the edge of Dry Hollow. The kind of place where chalk dust settled into the cracks of the floorboards and never really left. Folks knew her as polite, quiet, steady enough to handle a room full of restless children and still keep her voice gentle when the wind howled and the stove smoked. But there were things the town didn't know, or pretended not to know. Dry Hollow was good at pretending. It pretended a man's bruises were an accident. It pretended a woman's grief was private. It pretended that if you didn't say a thing out loud, the land wouldn't hear it. Grace had her own private weather. She'd lost people. That much was obvious if you looked close. She carried herself like someone who'd learned to survive disappointment by staying useful and staying small. And that morning, she'd been on her way to the general store for lamp oil and paper. Plain errands, plain life, when she heard something wrong in the air. It wasn't a scream. Dry Hollow didn't scream much. It was the sound of a door slamming and a man's voice clipped short with urgency. She recognized that rough voice too, Mason Reed. Most folks knew Mason by reputation, the ranch hand who didn't laugh, didn't linger, didn't take up space unless work demanded it. A man who'd been burned from the inside out by a tragedy nobody discussed with their full mouth. You could feel his silence from across a room. Grace didn't come to the clinic because she was curious. She came because something in her, something older than sense, heard the commotion and refused to keep walking. When she pushed open Dr. Hollis's door, the smell hit first. Camphor, alcohol, wood smoke,
and that sharp, clean edge a room gets when life is hanging by a thread. Dr. Hollis was bent over the exam table, moving fast. Mason was there too, pressed against the wall like he'd been ordered not to touch anything for fear he'd break it. And on the table, swaddled in warmed cloth, was a baby so still that Grace's hand flew to her throat before she even knew she'd lifted it. The child's lips were tinted wrong, her lashes clumped with damp, her hair, light as straw, was matted down as if the creek had tried to comb her into the earth. Grace stopped just inside the room. For a heartbeat, she couldn't step forward. Her body remembered too much. The look of a small chest that might not rise again, the terrible quiet between breaths, the helplessness of doing everything right and still losing. Dr. Hollis glanced up and saw her, and instead of asking what she was doing there, he spoke like he'd been waiting for her. "Miss Harper," he said, not unkindly but with steel in his tone, "I need you." Grace's lips parted. What came out wasn't a full refusal, just a soft, shaken sound. "No." Dr. Hollis didn't argue. He didn't plead. He simply kept moving, because doctors out here couldn't afford to be delicate when time was mean. "This child needs warmth, feeding, watching. I can treat her, but I can't sit at her side every minute. She'll slip away between my hands if nobody holds her steady." Grace didn't answer right away. Her eyes stayed on the baby's face. She wanted to turn around. She wanted to walk back out into the sun and dust and pretend she never saw that blue tint around the child's mouth again. But she didn't. Mason's voice came from the corner, rough like scraped cedar. "Found her in a sack in Crow water." The sentence sat in the room like a bad smell. A sack, a creek, a baby. You didn't need extra words to understand what kind of world could do that. Grace took a cautious step closer, as if the floor might give way beneath her. "She's alive?" she asked, though she could see the faint rise and fall. Hollis nodded. "Still, for now." That "for now" did something to Grace's spine. It straightened it. Anger and fear have a way of making a person honest. Hollis set a chair near the table with a nudge of his foot, then looked at her again. Really looked. His tone softened just enough to be a hook. "You're steady," he said. "Children trust you." Grace gave a short, sharp laugh that surprised her. It wasn't joyful. It was the kind of laugh that slips out when you're cornered by truth. "Children trust a lot of things," she said. "They trust thunder won't hit them. They trust grown men won't lie." Mason lifted his head at that, just slightly, as if the words hit somewhere close to home. Then the baby's eyes opened. Not wide, not bright, just open enough to show she was still here, still trying. Her eyes wandered for a moment, unfocused, and then, like a needle finding its groove, it settled on Grace. The baby made a sound, small, insistent, a reaching sound. Grace's breath caught. She felt, horribly, that old, forbidden warmth stirring behind her ribs, the thing she'd buried under routine and distance, and the belief that loving again only meant losing again. Dr. Hollis didn't waste a moment. He lifted the baby carefully, supporting her head and neck, and held her out to Grace like a man passing off a fragile lantern in a storm. Grace didn't move for a beat. Then her arms rose as if they belonged to someone else. When the baby was placed against her chest, something changed in the air. The child stopped fussing almost immediately. Her tiny hand found Grace's finger and closed around it with weak determination. And Grace went still. Not frozen, not frightened. Still the way a person goes still when they realize they've stepped into deep water and it's too late to pretend they're only waiting. Mason watched from the wall, and I remember thinking, years later, replaying that scene in my mind, that Mason looked like a man witnessing a miracle and being offended by how much he needed it. Grace's eyes shone, but she didn't let tears fall. She didn't want to start because she knew she might not stop. Dr. Hollis exhaled, a quiet release of tension, and returned to his supplies. "Keep her warm. Watch her breathing. If she coughs, if she turns gray, you call me immediately." Grace nodded, her voice gone. The baby shifted once and pressed her cheek into Grace's blouse like she'd been searching for that spot all along. Mason spoke, barely above the creak of the stove. "She likes you."
Grace didn't answer. She couldn't. Because liking wasn't the right word for what she felt in that moment. It was something deeper and more dangerous. Attachment forming like a knot, quick and tight. Mason stepped forward then, awkwardly, as if he wasn't sure where to put his hands in a room like this. "If you're doing this, I'll help." Grace looked up at him, surprised, not because she doubted he could work. Everyone knew Mason could work. It was everything else that seemed impossible. Gentleness, patience, the kind of care that asked you to stay soft when the world was hard. "You?" she asked, not mocking, just startled. Mason's mouth twitched, almost humor, almost self-awareness. "I can."
By the second day, the baby's color came back just enough that Dr. Hollis stopped muttering curses under his breath every time he checked her pulse. He still didn't smile. Out here, doctors didn't trust luck the way church folks did. Luck had a habit of turning on you the moment you thanked it. Grace stayed in the clinic's back room, where Hollis kept extra linens and an old cot. It wasn't a proper nursery, just rough boards, a thin mattress, and the smell of stove heat mixed with medicine. But it was warm, and warmth was everything. Mason came and went like a man tied to an invisible rope. He'd step outside as if he meant to return to ranch work, then drift back in again, drawn by the faint sounds of the baby's breathing like it was the only honest noise in town. Even Esteban, just a desert boy hanging around the edges, could feel the shift. The clinic, usually a place folks rushed through with clenched teeth, had become a kind of quiet center. Not peaceful, just focused, like everyone inside was holding the same fragile thing together with their hands. Grace learned fast. Her hands stopped shaking. Her voice found that calm tone teachers keep for frightened children. She fed the baby by spoon at first, then with a simple bottle Hollis rigged from what he had. He warmed cloths near the stove, tested them against her wrist, and watched for the slightest change in breathing the way a hawk watches grass. Mason tried to help, and watching him try was the first time anyone in Dry Hollow had seen the man look uncertain about anything. He'd wrestled cattle and fixed fence in dust storms, but a diaper was a different kind of enemy. The first time he attempted it, he stared at the cloth like it was a puzzle written in a language he didn't speak. He folded, unfolded, refolded, too careful, too stiff, and somehow ended up with the baby's feet tangled in the wrong corner. The baby squirmed. Mason froze, offended by the cloth's betrayal. And Grace laughed. Not loud, not carefree, just one small surprise burst that slipped out of her before she could catch it. Then she covered her mouth like she'd broken a rule. But Mason looked up as if he'd heard a bird sing in a burned forest. He didn't smile exactly. He just blinked, and something in his eyes softened, like he'd forgotten laughter was still allowed to exist in his world. "Looks like she's got you beat," Grace said, trying to sound practical, but the warmth in her voice gave her away. Mason grunted. "She's resourceful." Grace leaned in and fixed the fold with patient hands, guiding him without making a show of it. Mason watched closely, memorizing the movements like they mattered as much as any ranch skill. And when the baby finally settled, making a tiny please sound, Mason let out a slow breath like he'd been holding it for years. That was the day things began to feel almost normal. Almost. Because the West doesn't like normal. It gets nervous when people stop bracing. Late that afternoon, Dr. Hollis found something that changed the air in the room. It wasn't in the feed sack itself. The sack had been filthy, common, the sort of thing that could have come from anywhere. But inside the layers the baby had been wrapped in, there was a finer cloth, too soft to belong to ranch work, too carefully stitched to be an accident. Hollis unfolded it under the lamplight, and there, in one corner, was a neat little mark sewn in thread. A monogram. 2 letters joined like they'd been taught manners. Grace's face went still the moment she saw it. Teachers notice details. They have to. Hollis held the cloth up, squinting. "You recognize that?" Grace didn't answer right away. Her eyes stayed on the stitching, as if staring might make it change into something harmless. Then she said it quietly, like she hated the sound of it. "Wycliffe." Mason's head lifted. "Wycliffe who?" Grace swallowed once. "Cyrus Wycliffe." Even Esteban knew that name. Everybody did. Cyrus Wycliffe wasn't just wealthy, he was heavy, the kind of man whose money seemed to bend the town around him.
He had land enough to make the horizon look owned, a house built from cut stone while most folks patched their roofs with tin and prayer. Hollis lowered the cloth as if it might burn him. If this came from his household, he began. Mason's jaw tightened. Then this baby didn't end up in that creek by mistake. Grace pulled the baby closer without thinking, her arms forming a shield. The child, warm now and drowsy, nestled into Grace's chest like she knew exactly where safety lived. Hollis set the monogrammed cloth on a table, separating it from the other linens as if it carried a sickness. He rubbed his forehead with the heel of his hand, then exhaled through his nose. "I'm sending word to Sheriff Rusk." Mason turned toward the window, eyes scanning the street. The clinic's glass was dusty, and outside the town moved the way it always did, a wagon creaking by, a dog trotting through the road, porch boards groaning under old men shifting in their chairs. Normal life, the thin skin of it. Grace's voice came out low. What if they come for her? Hollis didn't soften it with comfort. He didn't have any despair. In this county, if that cloth is what it looks like, they won't come for the child. They'll come for quiet. They'll come for the story. They'll come to make sure nobody connects them to their name. Mason didn't turn from the window. "They tied her up," he said, voice steady and cold. "Whoever did that doesn't get to decide how it ends." Grace watched him, watched the way his shoulders held tension like a rifle held ready. She didn't see a man looking for a fight. She saw a man who'd already lost once to something unstoppable and wasn't willing to lose again without trying to break his hands on the door. Hollis wrote his message with tight, controlled strokes, sealed it, and sent it out with a runner. After that, there wasn't much to do except wait. And waiting is the most dangerous work in the West. Waiting gives fear time to grow teeth. As dusk crawled in and the lamps were lit, Grace rocked the baby in the back room. The child's breathing was steadier now, her fingers curled and relaxed. By sundown on the third day, Dry Hollow started acting the way a poker table acts when somebody pushes their whole stack into the middle. Quiet, watchful, suddenly careful with every breath. Not everyone noticed it, of course. Most towns have folks who can sleep through thunder and wake up only when the coffee's gone. But the ones who lived long enough to recognize danger without needing it spelled out, they felt it in their teeth. Inside Dr. Hollis's clinic, the air had turned thick. Stove heat, medicine, old wood, and a new smell that wasn't on any shelf. Fear, trying to behave. Mason Reed didn't wait for the town to decide what kind of night it was going to be. He moved like a man packing for a fire that hadn't started yet. Quiet steps, quick hands, no wasted motion. He checked his revolver without drama, the way you check a gate latch, because you'd be a fool not to. Grace Harper kept the baby close, wrapped tight in that cedar-smelling quilt Hollis had dug out of a chest. The baby, Wren by now, was breathing steadier, her little body warmer than it had any right to be after what she'd been through. But even sleeping, she seemed to sense the room tightening around her. Babies notice the things adults try to hide. Hollis stood near the counter, watching Mason and Grace with the kind of tired seriousness doctors get when they've done everything they can with hands and knowledge, and now it's up to the world whether it wants to cooperate. I lingered near the back door, half shadow, half curiosity. Boys like me learned early that trouble always sounded louder from a distance. Up close, it moved quiet. That's why I saw him first. A rider came in at sundown. Not fast, not slow, measured. The kind of pace that said, "I'm not worried about being stopped." His horse moved like it had been trained not to spook, and the rider sat easy in the saddle. Not loose, but comfortable in control. He tied up in the street like he had all the time in the world, then walked straight into Hollis's clinic without knocking. Dr. Hollis looked up and greeted him carefully, the way you might greet a stranger holding something fragile. The man smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was the kind of smile you see on a man who always gets what he wants and calls it reasonable. "Evening, Doc. Name's Peck. I'm looking for something that drifted into town. Something misplaced." Hollis didn't move much, but I saw his shoulders tighten. "We don't run a lost and found." Peck chuckled like Hollis had made a joke worth enjoying. Then he laid a paper on the counter. Clean, printed, sharp edges. The kind of paper that didn't get handled in Dry Hollow unless someone important wanted something done. It was a reward notice. It didn't need to be read out loud for the meaning to land, but Peck helped it along anyway, tapping it with 2 fingers. $500, he said, smooth as whiskey, for information leading to the return of an infant, wrongfully taken from her rightful guardians. Hollis's face went hard. Wrongfully taken. Peck shrugged, polite. Wording's important to some folks. Hollis lifted his eyes. Who sent you? Peck's smile didn't fade, but it cooled. A man who prefers not to be discussed in a doctor's office. From the back room, Grace's voice called, quiet and steady. Doctor? For half a second, the clinic went still. Peck's eyes flicked toward the hallway, curious in a way that made my skin crawl. Hollis stepped sideways, blocking the view. She's resting, he said, and his voice made it clear he wasn't interested in being questioned. Peck sighed softly, like he was disappointed in the town for making him work. Doc, I'm not here to argue. I'm here to carry something back where it belongs, and I'd like to do it without unpleasantness. That's when Mason spoke from the shadows, low and sharp. What belongs to who? Mason stepped into view like a door closing. Grace stood behind him holding Wren, her arms locked around that baby as if the quilt was stitched to her bones. Peck looked Mason over with casual recognition. Mason Reed, he said, tasting the name. Heard you've been keeping busy. Mason didn't answer. Peck nodded toward the bundle in Grace's arms. That's what I'm after. Grace tightened her grip. Wren stirred, making a small sound, not quite a cry, more like a warning that she knew the air had changed. Mason's voice went flat. You don't touch her. Peck's eyes stayed pleasant, but something hard showed underneath. Son, I don't need your permission. I need your cooperation. Mason dropped his hand near his belt. He wasn't drawing, not yet, but the intention sat there, plain as daylight. Hollis lifted a palm. This is a medical facility, he said, trying to pull the situation back from the cliff. Peck cut him off gently, like correcting a child. Then do what doctors do. Step aside. Grace spoke then, and her calm was the most dangerous thing in the room. She's not going anywhere. Peck finally looked at Grace directly. You're the schoolteacher, Grace Harper. Grace didn't flinch. Peck nodded once as if he approved of her and regretted her. That baby is part of a situation you don't want to be inside. It gets bigger than you. It gets ugly. Mason's jaw tightened. It already got ugly when someone tied a baby in a sack. For the first time, Peck's smile slipped just a fraction. He recovered fast, but I saw it. So did Mason. Peck pulled another paper from his coat, this one sealed. Message, he said, laying it down, from the man who don't want to be discussed. He says the child will be returned by sunrise, or he'll assume the town prefers trouble. Hollis stared at the seal like it was a snake curled on his counter. Grace's voice stayed quiet. And if we don't? Peck shrugged, almost kindly. Then men come who don't smile, and they won't bring paper. That was the moment I understood something important. Peck wasn't the real threat. Peck was the polite front door. The threat was whatever waited behind him. Peck backed toward the door, tipping his hat slightly. Sunrise, he repeated, like a clock ticking. Then he left, boots tapping the porch boards in steady little beats. Outside, thunder stomped once in the yard, ears pinned, as if even the horse didn't like how the air smelled. Inside, Grace looked down at Wren. The baby blinked, then reached up and touched Grace's chin with 2 tiny fingers, as if asking why everyone had turned to stone. Mason stared out the window, scanning the street like it might betray them. Hollis swallowed hard. Sheriff Rusk is gone to San Angelo. 2 days, maybe 3. Grace went pale. Mason didn't. His face didn't change much at all. It just set. Then he turned to Grace, voice low and certain. Pack what you can carry, he said. We're leaving tonight. Grace blinked at him, shocked. Where? Dry Hollow went quiet the way a poker table goes quiet when somebody pushes everything they've got into the middle. Not everyone noticed it. Some folks never notice trouble until it's sitting on their porch. But the people who'd lived long enough to recognize that kind of hush, Dr. Hollis, the undertaker, the women who kept extra flour hidden in coffee tins, they felt it in their bones. That night, Mason Reed didn't wait around for the town to decide what it wanted to be. He moved like a man packing for a fire that hadn't started yet. He didn't pace. He didn't argue. He didn't pray out loud. He just checked what needed checking, and he did it with the same steady hands he used on fence wire and saddle leather. I watched him from the edge of the room, half in shadow, trying to make myself small the way boys do when grown-up decisions start turning sharp. Mason opened his revolver, ran his thumb across the cartridges, and snapped it shut again like the sound was a promise. Not a loud promise, just a private one. Grace stood in the back room with the baby, Wren, wrapped tight in a quilt Dr. Hollis had pulled from an old chest. That quilt smelled like cedar and mothballs, like it had been waiting for a winter that finally arrived. Grace tucked the edges around Wren with the kind of care that didn't waste a single motion. You could tell she'd learned fast, how to keep a child warm, how to read breathing, how to hold steady, even when her face said she wanted to run. Dr. Hollis handed her a small tin of supplies, cloth, a bit of lard, a bottle, and a vial of something sharp enough to sting your nose just by being near it. Hollis's eyes looked tired in the lamplight, but his voice stayed firm. "She's stable," he said, "but don't confuse stable with safe." Grace nodded once, not trusting her voice. Mason glanced at me near the door and told me to go home. I didn't move. I didn't have a home that felt like it belonged to me, not really. And even if I had, I'd already seen the sack in Crowwater. Once you see something like that, you don't just go back to being a normal boy again. The world won't let you. Grace looked at me like a teacher looks at a stubborn student and decided she didn't have time to argue. "If he stays," she said, "he stays under instruction." I didn't know what that meant exactly, but I nodded like I did. It sounded important, and in a night like that, you clung to anything that sounded like order. Mason didn't let us out the front door, not with eyes on the street, not with trouble potentially waiting under porch lamps. We slipped out the back, into the alley behind the clinic, where the air smelled like old cabbage and horses. The boards creaked under our boots, and even that tiny sound felt loud. Grace held Wren close, the baby tucked beneath her chin, wrapped so tight only a small cheek and a bit of hair showed. Mason led us behind the general store, where stacked crates made long shadows. We moved through those shadows like we were borrowing them. I remember thinking the town's lanterns looked weaker from that angle, like Dry Hollow itself didn't want to witness what was happening. Behind the livery, Thunder waited, already saddled. Mason had done it earlier, quietly, like he'd been planning this before Peck ever laid that sealed letter on the counter. Thunder stood calm, but his ears kept flicking, picking up things the rest of us couldn't hear. Grace hesitated at the horse. She had that look of someone who'd ridden once, maybe, years ago, and had tried to forget the feeling afterward. Mason didn't waste time soothing her fear. He simply reached down and said, "You'll ride with her. Keep her warm." Grace climbed up behind him, awkward at first, then settling. Wren stayed pressed between them, a small bundle of breath and fragile weight. Mason's posture shifted the moment Grace and the baby were on the saddle, his spine tightening, his shoulders angling forward, as if his whole body had turned into a shield. Mason looked at me then. "You sure?" he asked, like he'd actually give me the choice. I lied the way boys lie when pride is the only coat they own. "I'm sure." He lifted me onto a sorrel horse, borrowed from the livery, an old animal with tired eyes and a patient mouth. My hands shook on the reins. I hated that they shook. But the horse didn't judge me, it just breathed. Then we moved. Not down Main Street, not past the saloon. We took the dry wash behind town, the old route folks used before they decided the new road was safer. The old road cut through rough country, the kind that could hide a man standing upright, the kind of land where the land itself could decide whether you lived. Dry Hollow fell away behind us, its few lights shrinking into dim points, like stars caught low on earth. The wind carried the smell of smoke and dust, and something else, something sharp, like change. The moon wasn't full. It hung thin and pale, like a shaving of bone. It didn't light the world so much as outline it, turning mesquite into black lace and rocks into dark teeth. We rode at a steady pace, not a gallop. Mason understood something I didn't back then. You don't outrun trouble by exhausting your horse in the first mile. You outrun trouble by staying smart longer than the men behind you can stay angry. Grace's voice came once from behind Mason, quiet enough it felt like she was speaking into the quilt. "Where are we going?" Mason didn't answer right away. He listened first, like he always did, as if the night itself might provide better directions than his memory. "Old line shack, by the Devil's Teeth. Roof still holds." Grace nodded, though she didn't like the sound of devil's teeth as much as I did. The baby stirred and made a small, uncertain sound. Not a full cry, more like the beginning of one. Grace lowered her head and whispered to Wren. I couldn't hear the words, but the tone was something I never forgot. It wasn't just comfort. It was a promise, made without paperwork, made with breath. Mason reached back once, briefly, steadying the bundle between them with his left hand. That touch was gentle, almost careful enough to be reverent, and it didn't fit the stories folks told about him in town. It made me realize how little people actually knew about one another out there. As we rode, the land grew rougher, the scrub thickened, stones started showing through the soil like old bones. The air cooled, and somewhere, behind us, far behind at first, I thought I heard something. Hooves. Not close, not clear, but there. I turned in the saddle and saw nothing but darkness and mesquite, and a stretch of trail that looked empty.
Still, the night felt crowded, like there were too many eyes in it. Maybe it was my imagination. Maybe it was fear doing what fear does. Or maybe the West was already sending a warning. When men like Peck smile and say sunrise, they don't sleep much between now and then. We rode on under that bone-thin moon, deeper into country that didn't care who you were or what you'd done. And somewhere out there, behind the last fence post and the last safe porch light, a rider named Peck began to close the distance, quiet, patient, and certain that the dark would do part of his work for him.
By the time they reached the Devil's Teeth, the night felt like it had teeth of its own. Those ridges weren't mountains, not really, just jagged limestone that rose out of the scrub at strange angles, like the earth had tried to bite the sky and cracked its jaw doing it. Moonlight slid over the rocks in thin, pale sheets, turning every sharp edge into a warning. Mason led them into a shallow draw where an old line shack sat half-hidden under catclaw and prickly pear. It wasn't much. Crooked door, a roof that sagged like a tired shoulder, but it was something with walls. Out there, walls counted. He dismounted first, and he didn't do it like a man arriving home. He did it like a man stepping into a room that might already be occupied. His eyes kept lifting to the ridgetops, listening more than looking. Thunder stood behind him, quiet but alert, ears flicking at sounds nobody else could catch. Grace slid down carefully with the baby bundled tight against her chest. Even in that rough country, she moved with a kind of practiced gentleness, like she was trying to keep the whole world from waking the child. Esteban, still just a boy, climbed off his sorrel and stood very still, throat tight, trying to breathe quietly enough that the night wouldn't notice him. Mason pushed the shack door open with his boot. The wood complained in a tired creak, and the sound seemed to travel too far in that emptiness. Inside, the air smelled like sun-baked boards and old sweat, abandoned human effort. Moonlight slipped through a small window, cutting the room into pale stripes. There was a broken chair, scraps of canvas, dust thick enough to feel like it had weight. Grace moved to the least dusty corner and sat down with the baby. She rocked gently, the way women rock without thinking when they're holding something precious. The child's breathing had steadied over the last day, but the cold of crow water still lived somewhere in her bones. Grace kept the quilt tugged tight, her arms making a shelter the shack couldn't promise. Mason didn't light a lamp. He didn't even strike a match. Light was a luxury. Light was also an invitation. He checked the back wall, the window, the corners, and then crouched near the doorway like he planned to become part of the frame. Minutes passed, the kind of minutes where you hear your own blood moving and start to wonder if that sound might give you away. That's when Grace spoke, quietly, as if she didn't want the words to echo. She needs a name. Mason didn't answer right away. He just turned his head slightly, listening to her in the same careful way he listened to the dark. Grace looked down at the baby's face, her expression softening into something dangerous. Dangerous because it meant she was already attached. A name makes her real, more real than a reward notice, more real than whatever they want her to be. The baby blinked slow and heavy, then settled again against Grace's chest like she had decided Grace was solid ground. Grace took a breath. "I keep thinking of the birds by Crowwater," she said, voice thin with memory. "How they build low in the reeds where nothing good ever floats." She paused, then said it like a secret she was handing the room. "Wren." Mason repeated it under his breath. "Wren." The baby's fingers flexed against a quilt, opening and closing like she was testing her grip on the world. In that tiny movement, something eased, just a fraction, in all of them. A name didn't fix anything, but it drew a line around the life and said, "This is not nothing." Esteban felt it too. He didn't understand why it mattered so much then, but he knew the words sounded like something that could survive. The quiet didn't last. First came hooves, faint at the edge of hearing. Not rushing, not lost. Careful, patient steps, like the riders weren't worried about the clock at all. Sound bounced strangely off the limestone ridges, doubling and twisting, turning one horse into two and two into four. The Badlands played tricks with your ears, and that was part of what made them dangerous. Mason lifted his hand, palm down. "Stay still." Grace's arms tightened around Wren. Esteban held his breath so hard his chest started to ache. Then a voice drifted in from outside, polite as Sunday. "Mr. Reed, You got a talent for making things difficult." Mason didn't answer. Peck chuckled, like this was friendly business. "Come on now, we can do this quiet, we can do it clean." A second voice cut in, rougher, impatient. "Peck, you talking to ghosts? Let's drag him out." Mason's jaw tightened. He shifted his stance slightly, angling his body so he was between the doorway and Grace. It was a small move, but it said everything. Peck's tone stayed smooth. "Easy, we don't want the baby bruised." Grace's stomach turned at that. Not because he sounded concerned, because he sounded concerned about why the baby was in a sack for the first place. Peck kept talking, letting names do the work. "Cyrus Wycliffe doesn't like chasing," he called. "He's a man who prefers doors opened for him." Inside the shack, the air went colder. Mason finally spoke, voice low and flat. "Tell Wycliffe he can buy new cloth." Peck sighed, patient as a banker. "It ain't about cloth." That's when Grace stood, not fast, not dramatic, just deliberate. She adjusted Grant's quilt and stepped closer to Mason. Her voice dropped so low it was meant only for him. "We can't keep running forever," she whispered. Mason didn't take his eyes off the doorway. "Tonight we can." Grace nodded once, like she accepted the truth of it. "Then make it count," she said. Outside, a match struck. The sound was tiny, sharp, and it made Esteban's skin prickle. A thin line of warm light bled under the door crack. They were going to smoke them out. Mason didn't wait to see flame. He drew and fired once, not at a man, but at the lantern Peck was lighting. The shot shattered glass with a pop like breaking ice. Kerosene splashed, flared bright for a heartbeat, then died into a hiss. Peck cursed, and for the first time his politeness cracked. "Back wall," Mason snapped. Grace moved immediately, guiding Esteban with her shoulder toward the rear corner where the wood looked weakest. Her hands found old boards and pushed. Nails screamed, dust shook loose. The shack fought them like it wanted to stay whole, but the years had already done most of the breaking. The boards gave way with a jagged tear, and cold night air rushed in, clean and sharp. Grace squeezed through first, ran tight to her chest. Esteban followed, scraping his shoulder and biting back a sound. Mason came last. They didn't ride back toward Dry Hollow after slipping out of the Devil's Teeth. Mason pushed them deeper into the rough country until the ridges softened into low, sunburned hills, and the mesquite thinned out into open stretches of grass that shivered under a hardening sky. By dawn, the world turned the color of old tin. The wind had teeth again, and the dust clung to everything: boots, hems, horsesweat, even the corners of tired eyes. Grace's arms ached from holding Wren so tightly, but she didn't loosen her grip. The baby's warmth was stronger now, and that small, steady heat felt like proof that the night had it won. Mason rode ahead, scanning the land like he expected it to betray them. He wasn't just looking for hoofprints. He was reading the country the way a ranch hand reads weather. Birds lifting too suddenly, a patch of scrub too still, the wrong kind of quiet. He moved with the calm focus of a man who'd already decided fear was useless weight. Esteban rode close enough to Grace to hear her breathe. The boy looked worn down in a way boys shouldn't, eyes too sharp, shoulders too tense. At one point, he finally asked the question that kept scratching at everyone's ribs. Where does this end? Grace didn't pretend she knew. She stared at Mason's back, at the way he held himself in the saddle, like the ground couldn't be trusted. "I don't know, but I know what it isn't." Esteban waited, and Grace's mouth tightened. "It isn't handing her over to men who speak of her like a parcel," she said, voice low, "like a mistake they can carry away." They rode until the sun climbed high enough to sting. Heat rose off the earth in a shimmer that made distant hills look like they were floating. Around mid-morning, Mason angled them toward a thin line on the horizon, telegraph poles, marching in a crooked row toward a small cluster of buildings. Piedra Station wasn't a town, not really. It was a siding and a water tank, a depot shack, and a telegraph office run by a man who looked like he'd been born tired and never recovered. Places like that weren't meant for living. They were meant for passing through, fast, quiet, and with your hands in view. Mason slowed the horses as they answered the station yard. Grace stayed mounted, Wren tucked against her chest. Esteban hovered near her like a guard dog that didn't realize how small he was. Mason dismounted and pulled his hat lower, as if he could hide his intent beneath the brim. Then he walked straight into the telegraph office. Inside, the air smelled like ink and hot metal and old wood. The operator looked up from his desk and squinted. "If you're selling cattle, go bother someone else." Mason didn't argue. He placed a coin on the counter. Just one, not flashy, but heavy enough to turn irritation into attention. Out on the frontier, money didn't solve every problem, but it opened doors quicker than kindness. "I need a message sent to the county marshal," Mason said, voice even, "and to a judge in Fort Concho." The operator's eyes sharpened at the name. Fort Concho meant uniforms. It meant paperwork. It meant trouble that didn't stay local. "That's military," the operator muttered. Mason didn't blink. "Then it'll reach someone who can read." The operator hesitated, then lowered his voice. "This about Wycliffe?" That name carried weight even out here. The operator said it the way you say storm, quietly and with a glance at the sky. Mason's jaw flexed once. "You know the name." The operator snorted. "Everyone knows the name. It's the kind you learn to say polite." Mason leaned in just a fraction. "Say it less politely today." Outside, Grace kept watching the yard. The winds carried dust and heat, and it carried something else too, a feeling that eyes were on her. Wren stirred and made a small complaint, and Grace hummed low under her breath. Not a song anyone taught her, more like a rope thrown across a gap. That's when Esteban spotted them. Two men lingered near the water tank, hats low, hands idle, bodies pretending to be casual. But their eyes weren't casual. Their eyes kept landing on Grace, then slipping away like thieves. Esteban edged closer to Grace. "We got company." Grace didn't panic. She just shifted her horse a step, putting space between her and the tank. Her body angled so the baby stayed shielded. Her calm was the kind that men underestimated her. Mason stepped out of the telegraph office at that moment. He took one look at the men and knew exactly what they were. One of them called out, too friendly, too loud. "Morning, you folks head anywhere in particular?" Mason answered without warmth. "Just passing through." The second man spat into the dust and nodded toward Grace's arms. "Wycliffe's looking for something. You seen any lost property?" Property. Grace felt her stomach turn at the word, like Wren was a sap bag somebody misplaced. Mason turned his head slowly, and for the first time Esteban saw a real smile touch Mason's mouth, small, cold, and humorless. "No," he said, "but I've seen a pair of fools standing too close to a man who's tired." The friendly man's face tightened. "You got a problem with Mr. Wycliffe?" Mason's voice stayed calm. "I got a problem with sacks and creeks." Hands drifted towards holsters. The station yard shrank. Even the wind seemed to hold back. Mason's revolver cleared leather smooth as breath. A shot cracked, but not into flesh. It hit the sand by a boot, bursting dust upward. "Back," Mason snapped. The men flinched, surprised by the fact that Mason Reed wasn't bluffing. Then another rider appeared from behind the depot. Peck. He rode in easy, hat low, posture relaxed, like he'd come to borrow sugar. He raised his hand like a preacher calming a room. "Easy," Peck called. "Let's not make this messy." Mason didn't lower his gun. "You already did." Peck's smile returned, thinner than ever. "I got orders, Reed." Mason's eyes flicked toward Grace, toward Wren, then back. "So do I." Peck spread his hands as if he hated violence. "You don't want to shoot in front of a lady and a baby." Grace's voice cut in, quiet and sharp. "You don't want to speak in front of a woman who teaches children to count." Peck glanced at her, amused. "Is that so?" Grace met his eyes. "Yes, because I can count how many men you brought, and I can count how many bullets Mason has left." Mason's mouth twitched, almost laughter, almost gratitude. Peck's gaze narrowed. Then, like a man looking for a softer target, he looked past Mason at Esteban. "You," Peck said gently. "You're the boy from Dry Hollow." Esteban froze. Peck smiled as if he cared. "You saw the sack, didn't you? Kids talk, kids slip. Come with us, son. You can eat good for a while. Better than sleeping behind the livery." Grace's spine stiffened. "Don't speak to him." Mason shifted just enough to block Peck's line. His voice dropped low, lethal. "You take one step toward that boy and I'll stop aiming at sand." Peck's smile faltered. Then the telegraph office door swung open. The operator stepped out holding a narrow paper strip, his face pale. "Mr. Reed," the operator said, voice shaking. "Message is sent. Fort Concho acknowledged." Peck's head snapped around. The polite mask cracked clean down the middle. "You did what?" Peck hissed. The operator swallowed. "I sent it." Peck's men shifted. Hands twitched. The air was about to turn into gunfire. Mason didn't wait. He fired not at a man, but at Peck's tack. The bullet snapped leather, and Peck's horse...
Fort Concho's men didn't arrive the way dime novels promised. No trumpet, no heroic dust cloud, no last-second cavalry cresting a hill with the sun behind them. Just 3 soldiers in sun-faded blue, riding practical horses with tired eyes, and a county marshal who carried a leather folder like it weighed more than any rifle. They came into Dry Hollow like men stepping into a room where somebody had been lying for a long time. Word moved ahead of them, the way it always does in a small town. You could feel it in the porch sitters who stopped rocking, in the general store door that stayed closed a little longer than usual, in the way the wind seemed to drag dust across the street slower, like even the weather wanted to listen. Mason Reed brought us back in daylight, not because he thought the town was safe, but because he knew the story had to land somewhere solid. Running kept you alive, sure, but it also kept the truth scattered, and scattered truth is easy to bury. Sheriff Rusk had returned from San Angelo the same morning, angry and embarrassed in equal parts. Angry that trouble had bloomed while he was gone, embarrassed because the trouble had a name with money behind it. He tried to act like a man in charge, but it was hard to keep your spine straight when soldiers were standing in your office watching you breathe. The marshal set up in that sheriff's office and made it feel like a different building. He didn't shout, he didn't threaten. He just took out paper and started asking questions like the answers mattered. In a place like Dry Hollow, that alone was dangerous. It didn't take long for the shadow to show up. Cyrus Wycliffe arrived before sunset in a black carriage that looked too clean for our roads. The horses pulling it were matched, sleek, and disciplined, the kind of animals you bought when you wanted the world to know you could. He stepped down dressed like money, dark coat, fine boots, silver watch chain. His face wore that practiced calm powerful men keep ready, the kind that says, "I'm offended you've made me come in person." Peck rode behind them, hat low, jaw tight. He didn't look like he was enjoying himself anymore. Wycliffe walked into the sheriff's office like he owned the air in it. He didn't nod at the marshal as if they were equals, and announced, as smooth as polished wood, that all of this was an unfortunate misunderstanding. The marshal didn't stand. He didn't smile either. He just looked at Wycliffe like a man looks at a stain on a clean shirt. "A baby in a feed sack isn't a misunderstanding," the marshal said. Wycliffe's expression didn't crack, but his eyes cooled. Allegations get dramatic in small places. Grace stood near the back of the room with Wren in her arms, the quilt wrapped snug, the baby's face calm for the first time in days. Mason stood nearby, not touching Grace, not crowding her, but positioned like a man who decided where the danger would have to pass through if it wanted the child. Wycliffe looked at the baby only once, briefly, clinically. Then he looked straight at Grace, and something flickered behind his eyes. Recognition. Not of her name, maybe, but of what she could remember. Grace didn't flinch when he spoke to her. "Miss Harper," he said, polite as poison, "you're involving yourself in matters beyond your station." Grace answered in the same tone she used when children tried to lie about stealing chalk. Calm, clear, unmoved. "My station includes children." Wycliffe said the baby belonged to his household. Dr. Hollis, standing off to one side, finally spoke like he couldn't hold it in anymore. "Your household left her in Crow Water." Wycliffe turned towards Hollis with that slow contempt rich men reserve for hired help with opinions. "Doctor, you've always been sentimental." That word, sentimental, hung in the room like an insult aimed at everyone who'd ever kept someone alive. The marshal opened his folder and began listing what he had. Testimony from Piedra Station, a doctor's report, a recovered sack, twine, circumstance. Wycliffe listened with a faint smile, and you could tell he was already building his escape out of language. Men like him didn't run on horseback, they ran on loopholes. "And you have no proof who tied it," Wycliffe said, smoothly. For a breath, it almost worked. That's how power survives, by turning the ugliest act into a question mark. Then Grace stepped forward. "I know the monogram," she said. Wycliffe's eyes sharpened. Grace didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The cloth wasn't a ranch brand. It belonged to Wren Clara, your niece.
The room shifted like a floorboard giving way under weight nobody wanted to acknowledge. Sheriff Rusk frowned as if the word niece didn't fit his understanding of the world. Grace kept going. She spoke about teaching Clara, about a bright girl who went quiet, about bruises that showed up like weather. The kind of bruises towns pretend not to see when the man responsible owns half the county. Wycliffe tried to dismiss it as slander. Then Dr. Hollis admitted what he'd kept locked behind his teeth. That he'd been called to Wycliffe's place months earlier, not for a normal visit, but for complications, and he'd been pressured to sign a statement saying he'd never been there. "I didn't sign," Hollis said. The marshal's pen moved. Wycliffe's calm finally tightened. "I'm admitting nothing." But the room wasn't listening to him the way it used to. Soldiers were watching. Townspeople were listening from the doorway. The air was changing. And then the door burst open with a shout from outside. A breathless voice announced there was a woman at the edge of town, claiming her name was Clara. It was like a ghost had walked into daylight. When Clara was brought in, she looked sunburned and thin, hair cut unevenly like she'd done it herself with a knife. Her eyes held the kind of fear that had burned down into something harder. Behind her stood Seña Tomasa, an older Lipan midwife from the scrub country, steady as stone. The sort of woman people went to when they wanted help without a ledger attached. Clara's gaze landed on Wren and Grace's arms, and her face broke. Not into loud sobbing, not into drama, just one strangled exhale, like she'd been holding that breath since the day she woke up empty. "That's her," Clara whispered. "That's my girl." Wycliffe stepped forward with a gentle voice that didn't match his eyes. "Clara, you've been unwell, confused. Come home." Clara stared at him like she was seeing the shape of her own nightmare. "Home?" she said. "You mean the room you locked from the outside?" The marshal asked Clara to tell what happened, plain. Clara spoke in pieces at first, then steadier. She'd given birth. Tomasa had helped her. She'd bled badly. She'd slept. When she woke, the baby was gone. Wycliffe told her the child had died. Then she heard whispers about a sack and crow water, and she walked back to town because she couldn't stand the lie living unchallenged. As Clara spoke, Peck shifted. His eyes kept cutting towards Grace, towards Wren. And that's when the room's danger changed shape. Peck lunged. Not towards Clara, towards the baby. He moved fast, trying to snatch Wren out of Grace's arms in the confusion. Like if he could just remove the evidence, the story would collapse. Mason reacted like lightning. He caught Peck's wrist mid-grab and slammed him into the wall hard enough to shake dust from the boards. Peck swung a desperate punch, caught Mason's cheek, but Mason didn't even blink. He drove his shoulder in and pinned him there, holding him like a nail through rotten wood. Soldiers surged forward, rifles coming up. Sheriff Rusk shouted. The marshal barked for order. Grace backed away instinctively, turning her body sideways to shield Wren, the quill pulled tight like armor. Pinned and breathing hard, Peck finally said the quiet part out loud. He was afraid of what Wycliffe did to people who failed him. And in that ugly honesty, the room understood what Wycliffe truly owned in Dry Hollow. Not land, not cattle. Fear. The marshal stepped in closer, voice low and official, and informed Wycliffe he was being detained pending investigation. Attempted murder of an infant, obstruction, intimidation. Wycliffe looked offended, as if the idea was improper.